What happens when the love you've given is betrayed? Ethan thought he had it all, until the woman he trusted left him for someone else. Now, as his life shatters, he fights back with a vengeance. But when revenge becomes healing, will he ever find peace, or will the past haunt him forever? Watch as the truth unfolds. Who will truly pay the price? Don't miss this gripping emotional journey. Stay with us to find out how it all ends. Where are you when you're watching this? Are you ready to dive deep into a story of love, betrayal, and redemption? Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him. It had been 2 days since he'd found the strange message on Vanessa's phone. The words haunted him, taunting him in the silence of their once peaceful home. "Can't wait to see you tonight." He had wanted to dismiss it as nothing, maybe just a harmless text from a friend. But there was a part of him, buried deep down, that couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Vanessa had been acting different for the past few months. The late nights at work, the sudden bursts of silence when they were together, the way she'd look away whenever he asked her anything too personal. The thought gnawed at him, pulling at him with the subtle force of something he couldn't ignore. But he pushed it down, as he always did, telling himself that he was just overthinking it. Still, the question lingered. What was really going on? The clock on the wall ticked loudly as he ran his fingers through his hair, his mind racing. He had trusted her completely. Vanessa had always been the center of his world, their marriage, their life. Everything had felt so right. How could it have changed so quickly? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion gnawing at him. He picked up his phone, fingers trembling as he scrolled through their recent text messages. Normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. A few updates about their schedules, a picture of their last trip. He paused, but it was always so ordinary. Too ordinary. Maybe that's the problem. His gut churned. Maybe this was it, the moment he would uncover the truth. He told himself that he wouldn't confront her until he had real evidence, but he couldn't stop the feeling that everything was unraveling before him. Vanessa had come home late the night before, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. He hadn't said anything, but he couldn't shake it. The feeling was there, the one that told him something was wrong even when she was smiling and acting like everything was normal. How could she hide it from him? The kitchen light flickered as he set the phone down, his thoughts racing. His heart was heavy, the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. Could he trust her? Could he trust himself? Then, just as he was about to push the thought away and focus on work, the sound of Vanessa's car pulling into the driveway broke through his thoughts. He froze. She was home early. Ethan quickly glanced at the phone again, the message still glaring at him. He closed his eyes, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. What if I'm right? He didn't know if he was ready to face it. He didn't know if he was ready to confront the possibility that the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, was hiding something, someone, from him. But the question remained, demanding an answer. He heard the front door creak open, and he quickly stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, his breath shallow. He would wait. He would hold on to this tiny sliver of hope, even though it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "Hey, you're home early," he said as she entered, trying to sound casual. But his voice betrayed him. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I didn't have much work left." She paused, glancing at him for a moment before walking into the kitchen. "How was your day?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her closely, searching for any hint of the truth. Vanessa turned back, giving him a quick smile, but Ethan could see it. The distance, the avoidance, the cracks in the facade. "I'm going to take a shower," she said quickly, turning away before he could speak. Ethan stood still, his heart pounding. She hadn't answered his question. She hadn't even looked at him properly. The suspicions he had been suppressing flooded back in full force. Something was wrong. As she disappeared into the bathroom, Ethan sat back down at the table, staring at his phone again. There it was. The message. He couldn't escape it. The truth was out there. He just had to face it. But did he want to? The soft sound of running water from the bathroom did little to drown out the thoughts racing through Ethan's mind. His heart pounded in his chest. a steady beat that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. He sat at the kitchen table, the phone in his hand trembling as he stared at the message from Jake once more. "Can't wait to see you tonight." The words felt like a slap across his face. Ethan had never imagined his life would come to this. The woman he loved, the one he trusted more than anything, was betraying him. But here it was, staring at him like a cold, ugly truth. Vanessa had barely been in the house an hour, and yet it felt like a lifetime. He could hear the faint sound of her moving around in the bathroom, preparing herself for something. But he wasn't sure what. What had she been planning for tonight? What had she already done? His hands clenched the phone tighter, but the shaking didn't stop. "I need to know," he thought, as if some part of him was desperate to be proven wrong. But another part, his gut, was already certain. His heart ached at the thought of confronting her again. What if she denied it again? What if she lied right to his face? He couldn't take that. He needed answers, and he needed them now. With a sharp breath, Ethan unlocked the phone and opened the text messages again. He couldn't help but scroll back further, searching for something, anything that could confirm what was happening. That's when he saw it. The name. Jake Lawson. His stomach dropped. The name sent a surge of anger through him. He'd known Jake for years, but the thought of him now, as Vanessa's lover, made Ethan's blood boil. How could Jake, someone he trusted, be the one to tear his life apart? His finger hovered over the screen. He wanted to call her right now, confront her face to face, but something inside told him to wait, to gather his strength first. He clicked on the conversation. There was nothing subtle about the texts, no veiled language, no hidden innuendo. They were straight to the point. Jake had sent a photo, clearly taken from some private moment between them, and the message had read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Another text followed. "I'll be there at 8. We can finally be alone." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Every word felt like a punch. His eyes blurred as anger and sorrow mixed into one overwhelming feeling. How could she? How could she be so cold? To betray him, to do this to their marriage, to throw away everything they had built together. His mind raced as he heard the bathroom door open behind him. He didn't turn around. His eyes were glued to the phone. Ethan's hands felt clammy as he reached for his keys, his pulse quickening. The image of Jake and Vanessa, locked together, flashed in his mind. He had to get out. Vanessa stepped into the kitchen, dressed for a night out, unaware of the storm brewing in Ethan's mind. She smiled, and the look on her face almost stopped him in his tracks. How could she still smile? He wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. "You're leaving?" she asked, noticing his movement. Ethan stood up, his back stiff, his jaw clenched. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. Vanessa looked confused, the smile slipping from her face. I was just going to meet Jake," she started, but when she saw the fire in Ethan's eyes, she faltered. "Why are you asking?" Ethan's breath was ragged now. He walked towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think I didn't know, Vanessa? You think I couldn't see it? I know about you and him. I saw the messages, I saw everything." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You betrayed me," Ethan continued, his voice cold, cutting through the air like a knife. "You've been lying to me. I trusted you, and now I have nothing left. Nothing." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. "Ethan, please. I didn't want to hurt you. I never meant for this to happen." Ethan took a step back, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You never meant to hurt me? You think that makes it okay?" His voice broke, the weight of it too much to bear. The tears began to fall down Vanessa's cheeks as she reached for him. "I made a mistake. I'm so sorry," she whispered. But the words felt hollow now. The truth was out, and nothing she could say would ever undo the damage she had caused. Ethan's heart ached. He wanted to yell, to scream at her, but all he could do was stare at her, lost in the reality of her betrayal. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. And in that moment, he knew there was no going back. Ethan's mind was spinning as he stared at Vanessa, her tear-streaked face begging him for forgiveness. He couldn't speak. The words that had been building in his chest for weeks now felt stuck, suffocating him. His heart hammered against his ribs, and it was as though his whole world had just collapsed. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. "I was confused. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." But her words were empty, hollow, and for the first time in their entire relationship, Ethan couldn't bring himself to believe her. How could he? "You were never confused, Vanessa," he finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You made a choice, a conscious decision. Don't sit here and tell me you were confused." Her lips trembled as she tried to reach out for him, but he stepped back, his eyes locked on hers with a painful clarity. She had crossed a line that could never be erased. "I'm sorry," she repeated, but the words felt like sand slipping through his fingers. "Sorry," a word that now meant nothing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan could feel the weight of her presence like a physical thing, pulling him in opposite directions, his love for her clashing violently with the betrayal she had laid before him. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was everything she had hidden from him, everything that he had trusted her with. "I know what you've been doing, Vanessa," he said, his voice a low growl. "You didn't just sleep with him, did you? You're planning to leave me for him, weren't you?" Vanessa flinched as if he had slapped her. Her eyes widened with shock, but Ethan could see it. He saw it in her face before she could hide it. It was true. She had been planning this. She had already made her choice. She had already begun to build a future with Jake, leaving him behind, a shadow of the life they'd once shared. A sickening feeling twisted in Ethan's stomach, but he didn't look away. He wanted her to see the pain in his eyes. He needed her to see it, needed her to understand what she had done. I don't know how it happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake and it's complicated. He makes me feel things, Ethan. Things I haven't felt in a long time." Ethan's fist clenched at his side. It took everything in him not to shout. "So that's it then?" he asked, the bitterness in his voice like a blade. "I wasn't enough for you, I never was. All these years I've been right here and you—" He choked on the words. "You chose him. You chose him over me." Vanessa stepped forward, but this time Ethan didn't move. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. But there was no warmth in her touch, no sincerity. The damage was done. The silence between them was deafening. Ethan could feel the space that had opened between them, a gap that no amount of apologies or regret could ever close. He had been right. All the signs had been there. The late nights, the distance, the lies. It all made sense now. Vanessa had been living in a world of her own, and he had been blind to it, believing that their love was enough to overcome anything. But love, he realized, wasn't enough when trust was broken, when loyalty was betrayed. "Tell me something," Ethan said, his voice cold, the pain now replaced with anger. "Do you even love him? Or is this just about escaping? Escaping what you've built with me, with us?" Vanessa's face crumpled in sorrow. I don't know. I don't know what to feel anymore. It's been so complicated for so long." The words stabbed at him, each one digging deeper into his chest. She didn't know. She didn't even know what she felt. And that hurt more than anything else. "I trusted you," Ethan muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I loved you, Vanessa, and this is how you repay me?" He didn't wait for her to respond. He couldn't. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. Ethan turned away from her, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with all the unspoken words between them. But nothing could undo the damage. Nothing could repair the trust she had shattered. As Ethan stepped toward the door, ready to leave this chapter of his life behind, Vanessa called out to him, her voice breaking. "Ethan, please, don't leave like this." He didn't stop. He couldn't. And with that, Ethan left, walking away from the woman he once loved, from the life he thought they had built together. He stepped into the unknown, into the painful uncertainty of a future without her. Ethan sat in his car, parked outside his office building, staring at the blank screen of his phone. The text messages from Vanessa still burned in his mind. But it wasn't just the betrayal that was eating him alive. It was the fact that he couldn't focus. The emotional storm he'd been trying to contain was now spilling over, disrupting everything in his life. His work, once a sanctuary, felt like an unbearable weight. His heart was still reeling, but it had to be buried, for now. He couldn't afford to show weakness. But as the minutes ticked by, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. Vanessa, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a call from Ryan. "Hey, man," Ethan answered, his voice strained. "Ethan, you all right? You've been distant. What's going on?" Ryan's voice was concerned, but it didn't match the storm Ethan was going through. How could he explain it? "I'm fine," Ethan muttered. "Just dealing with stuff." Ryan was silent for a moment. "You sure? You've been acting weird. I know we've been busy with work, but I feel like I'm losing touch with you." Ethan didn't know how to respond. His best friend, the one person he trusted, was reaching out, but Ethan didn't have the emotional bandwidth to explain. How could he talk about Vanessa? How could he say the words aloud, "She betrayed me"? He had already told himself he would never let it get to this point, but here he was, unable to move forward, unable to make sense of any of it. "I'll call you later," Ethan finally said, ending the call abruptly. He couldn't talk to Ryan. Not about this, not when everything felt so raw and unfinished. Ethan walked into the office building, mechanically making his way to his desk. But the walls felt tighter than before. Every corner of the office felt foreign. His mind was clouded, and all he could think about was Vanessa, her empty apologies, her broken promises. His boss, Karen, approached his desk with a report in hand. "Ethan, got a minute?" she asked, her tone professional but sharp. "Yeah, sure," he said, standing up. He wasn't sure if he was ready for anything more than work right now, but he followed her into the conference room anyway. As Karen started talking, Ethan barely registered her words. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the image of Vanessa's face as she begged for forgiveness. Every plea, every word felt like a fresh wound. "What's going on, Ethan?" Karen's voice snapped him back to reality. "I'm fine," he said, trying to regain his composure, but Karen's eyes narrowed as if she could sense his disarray. "Look, you're clearly distracted," Karen continued. "We need you at your best for the upcoming project. If something's bothering you, you need to take care of it. Don't let it mess with your work." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he stared at the report in his hands, his vision blurry. He couldn't focus on work anymore. It felt pointless. He couldn't focus on anything other than the gaping hole Vanessa had left in his heart. He stood abruptly. "I'll handle it, Karen. Thanks." And with that, he left the conference room, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Outside, the city noise buzzed in the background, but it all felt muffled, distant. Ethan's thoughts were tangled in the confusion of what he was supposed to feel. Betrayal, resentment, disbelief. Was he supposed to hate Vanessa now? Could he ever look at her the same way? He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the weight of the world on his shoulders, but it wasn't just the affair that was breaking him. It was the slow realization that he no longer recognized the person standing in front of him. Who had he become? His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Vanessa. He didn't want to read it. He didn't want to hear more empty apologies, but he couldn't stop himself. He opened the message. "I'm sorry, please, Ethan, please don't walk away. I made a mistake. I'm lost without you." The word sent a shock through him, but it was different now. His heart was numb. Vanessa's pleas were no longer enough to sway him. It was too late for apologies. She had crossed the line. He couldn't go back. His hands were shaking, and for a brief moment he wanted to throw his phone into the street. But instead, he turned it off. He was done. Done with the lies. Done with the uncertainty. But even as he walked away, he knew that this was just the beginning of the end. The worst was yet to come. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His eyes were fixed on the suitcase sitting open at the foot of the bed, a symbol of everything he was about to leave behind. He had packed only the essentials, clothes, toiletries, but it was more than just his belongings. It was his life, his entire existence with Vanessa, now reduced to a few simple items. The house felt empty, despite the lingering scent of Vanessa's perfume that still clung to the air. It was a cruel reminder of the woman who had betrayed him. He had trusted her, he had loved her with everything he had, and now he was walking away. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. The emotional weight was unbearable, but this was the only way forward. He had tried to convince himself that things could be fixed, that they could somehow heal and rebuild their relationship. But how could they when trust had been completely shattered? How could he continue living with someone who had broken him, not just once but repeatedly? His phone buzzed again, and he picked it up without thinking. Another message from Vanessa. He had stopped reading them days ago, but something in him, maybe hope, maybe desperation, urged him to open it. "Ethan, please. I know I've hurt you. I know I've betrayed you and I can never take that back. But I can't lose you. I can't. I'm so sorry. Please don't leave me." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding as he read the words. There it was again. The apology, the regret. But it felt empty. How many times had he heard those same words? How many times had he accepted them only to be let down again? His hand trembled as he set the phone down. The sound of it clicking against the wooden surface echoed through the silence of the room. He could feel the weight of the decision in his gut. It hurt, more than he could ever express. But it wasn't just the affair anymore. It was everything that had led up to it. The lies, the distance, the constant feeling that he was invisible to her. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep pretending that they could fix what was broken when the pieces were so far gone. Ethan stood up, walking to the window. The view of the city outside, bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun, seemed so distant. The world was moving on, as it always did. But for Ethan, everything felt still, frozen in a moment that he couldn't escape. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He froze. He knew who it was before he even moved. Vanessa. She had been gone all afternoon, likely trying to give him space, but he knew she couldn't stay away for long. He walked to the door, taking a deep breath before opening it. There she was, standing in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and for a moment Ethan almost faltered. He wanted to take her in his arms and tell her everything would be okay. He wanted to hold on to the hope that their love could still survive this. But he couldn't. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter as they left his lips. Vanessa's face crumpled and she took a step toward him, her hands reaching out. "No, Ethan, please. Don't do this. Please don't leave me. I'll do anything. I'll change, I swear." Ethan shook his head, his eyes hardening. "You don't get it, do you? You've already made your choice. You made it when you decided to sleep with him. You made it when you kept lying to me. You've already left me. You just didn't have the guts to say it." The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Ethan, please." But Ethan couldn't stay. He couldn't stay and pretend anymore. He had to do this for himself, for his own sanity. "I'm done, Vanessa," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of pain and finality. "I loved you, but you broke me. I can't fix this. I can't fix you, and I can't keep doing this to myself." She reached for him one last time, but he stepped back out of her reach. With that, he turned and walked away from the woman who had once been his whole world. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one pulling him farther from the life he had known. As he picked up the suitcase, the door to their home closing behind him, Ethan finally understood. He wasn't walking away from her. He was walking away from the version of himself that had allowed this to happen. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. Ethan stared at the blank walls of his new apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside doing little to calm his restless mind. The silence in the room was overwhelming, the kind of silence that filled every empty space in his heart. He had left everything behind. His marriage, his life, his dreams of a future he thought he was building with Vanessa. Now all he had was this small, unfamiliar apartment and the haunting question of what came next. He had been here for a week now, and every day felt like another step further into a new world, one that didn't include her. It felt strange, this freedom. It wasn't the kind of freedom he had imagined when he was dreaming of a life beyond the hurt. He thought that leaving would feel like a release, but all it did was leave him more empty than before. He ran his fingers over the edge of the coffee table, the only piece of furniture he had unpacked so far. There was nothing here to anchor him, nothing that felt like home. It wasn't his home anymore. It was just a place where he slept and ate, where he tried to pretend like everything wasn't falling apart. He closed his eyes, remembering Vanessa's face when he walked out the door. She had begged him to stay. Her voice cracked as she whispered his name, but he couldn't listen anymore. He couldn't stand there and watch the woman who had betrayed him, who had broken him, begging for forgiveness. The truth was, he didn't believe her anymore. The promises, the apologies, it all felt like a performance, like something she was doing because she didn't want to face the consequences of her actions. But even now, his mind replayed her words over and over. "Please don't leave me. I'll change. I swear." His stomach churned. He didn't want to hear it anymore. Every word felt like a lie. But it wasn't just her. It was the version of himself he had left behind. The man who had put so much trust into a relationship that was now shattered. The sound of his phone vibrating on the counter pulled him from his thoughts. It was a text from Ryan. He had barely spoken to him since the night he left. The silence had been mutual, both of them uncertain about how to navigate the mess that Ethan was in. "How you holding up?" Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. How was he holding up? He could say fine. He could lie and tell Ryan he was okay. He had been good at lying to himself, so what was one more lie? But instead he typed, "Not great. I've never felt more alone." The reply came almost immediately. "Want to grab a drink tonight?" For the first time in days, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something close to hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. He had friends, he had Ryan, he had people who cared about him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, Ethan met Ryan at a local bar. The place was dimly lit, the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices creating a low hum of activity around them. Ryan was already at a table nursing a beer when Ethan walked in. He looked up and offered a small smile, one that spoke more of concern than anything else. "You look like hell," Ryan said, his tone light but with an underlying seriousness. Ethan chuckled dryly and sat down. "I feel like it too." Ryan didn't waste time. "So, tell me what's going on. How's the new place? Have you heard from Vanessa?" Ethan shook his head, the bitterness rising in his chest. "I haven't heard from her in a few days. I don't think I want to, honestly." Ryan nodded, understanding without needing to say anything more. They both knew what Ethan was going through. "You know," Ryan started, looking at him with a serious expression, "it's going to hurt for a while, but you'll get through it. You're not the first guy to get screwed over by someone he trusted. It sucks, but it doesn't define you." Ethan let out a sigh, his fingers curling around the bottle in front of him. "I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again. I don't even trust myself right now." Ryan leaned in, his gaze steady. "You will. It'll take time, but you have to start somewhere. This is your chance, Ethan. You don't have to go back to what was. You have a chance to build something new. And it doesn't have to be about her anymore. It's about you now." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight in his chest lighten, just a little. Ryan's words weren't a magic cure, but they were a reminder. A reminder that there was still life beyond the pain, that there was still hope in moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized he didn't have to have all the answers right now. He just had to keep moving, one step at a time. Vanessa sat in the dim light of her living room, the silence stretching around her like a suffocating fog. She stared at the empty glass of wine on the coffee table, her fingers grazing the rim absent-mindedly. Her mind was a tangled mess, a whirlwind of regret and confusion. But the one thing that stood out above everything else was the gaping hole Ethan had left behind. She hadn't seen him since the day he walked out, since the day he finally stopped pretending that everything was fine. He was gone, and so was everything she thought she knew. She closed her eyes, letting the memories flood back. The look on Ethan's face as he walked away, the way his voice cracked as he told her he was done. She could still hear his words echoing in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. "I loved you, but you broke me." It was too late now. Too late for apologies. Too late for fixing what had been shattered. But the guilt was consuming her. She had betrayed him. She had let him down. And now she was left alone with the wreckage of her actions. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced down, half hoping it was Ethan. A foolish thought. But it wasn't him. It was a message from Jake. "We need to talk. I don't think things are working between us." Vanessa's stomach twisted into knots. She had been so sure of Jake, so sure that he was the answer to everything that was missing in her life. But now, in the wake of Ethan's departure, she realized just how much she had been blinded by her own desires. Jake had never been what he seemed. He had promised her a future, but it was always about him, about his needs, his plans. She was just a pawn in his game. The tears started to fall before she could stop them. She wiped at her eyes angrily, trying to keep herself together. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. This wasn't how she had imagined her life. She had wanted freedom. She had wanted something new, something exciting. But now, all she had was emptiness. Her phone buzzed again. She opened the message from Jake, but this time she didn't even want to read it. "I don't need you. I've moved on. You can figure out your life without me." The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. Jake was done with her. He had been done with her from the beginning, and she had been too blind to see it. Her heart ached with the realization that she had lost everything. She had lost Ethan, the one person who had truly loved her, and now she had lost Jake too. What had she done? Her thoughts drifted back to Ethan, the way he had looked at her in the last moments before he left. There had been pain in his eyes, but there had also been something else, something like finality. He had given up on her, on them. She had pushed him away, one lie at a time, and now she was paying the price. It was too late for reconciliation. Ethan had moved on, and she was left here, alone, with nothing but her own mistakes. Vanessa sat back on the couch, her mind a haze of confusion and regret. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. What had she been thinking? How could she have been so blind? The realization came slowly, painfully. She had been chasing something she thought she wanted, but all along she had been running from the one thing that mattered most, Ethan. Now it was gone. There was no fixing it, no turning back. She had lost him, and there was nothing left to do but live with the consequences of her choices. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Vanessa let out a long, shaky breath. This was my fault. The tears came harder now, but there was no one left to comfort her. No one left to fix this mess she had made. All she had was the truth, and it was a truth that was too painful to bear. Vanessa sat in the quiet of her apartment, staring at the same screen that had started it all. Jake's message. The final one. "I don't need you. I've moved on. You can figure out your life without me." The words stung, and yet they didn't surprise her. It was the culmination of everything she had been too blind to see before. She had allowed herself to be swept away by emotions, by the illusion of something better, only to find herself completely alone. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to make sense of the chaos in her life. Ethan was gone, and now Jake had cast her aside, just like everyone else had. How had she gotten here? How had it all unraveled so completely? Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from her best friend, Lila. She hesitated before answering, knowing the conversation would be heavy, but there was no avoiding it now. "Vanessa," Lila's voice cracked through the line, "I've been hearing things. You need to explain yourself." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She could hear the judgment in Lila's voice, the disappointment she had been trying to ignore for so long. "Lila, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Lila replied, but her tone was sharp. "But you've hurt people, Ethan especially, and you need to face it. You can't keep running from this." Vanessa wanted to argue, to explain herself, to convince Lila that she hadn't meant to destroy everything, but she knew deep down it was too late for apologies. Too late for everything. "Do you realize what you've done?" Lila pressed. Jake is just using you. You've wasted your love on him, and now look where you are, alone." The words hit Vanessa like a slap in the face. She had been too consumed with her own pain to see the truth that had been glaring at her. Jake had never been the man she thought he was. He wasn't the savior, the answer to her loneliness. He had been an escape, nothing more. "I know," Vanessa whispered, barely audible. "I see that now, but it doesn't change anything. Ethan's gone. Jake doesn't want me. I'm just alone." Lila was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. "You've got to make this right. You can't just sit there and wallow in your own mess. You have to apologize to Ethan. You have to fix this, Vanessa, before it's too late." Fix it? How could she fix this? The thought seemed impossible. Ethan had already made his decision. He had already walked away, and she had no way of undoing the damage she had caused. "Do you really think he'll listen to me?" Vanessa asked, her voice breaking. Lila didn't respond right away. "You have to try," she finally said. "If you care about him at all, you need to show him that. You've lost him, but you might still have a chance if you're willing to fight for it." Vanessa thought about it, the crushing weight of regret pressing down on her chest. She had betrayed the one person who had always been there for her, the one person who had loved her unconditionally, and now she was left with nothing but the fallout of her choices. Her phone buzzed again, a notification from the bank this time, but she didn't bother to check it. Everything felt irrelevant now. She had lost Ethan. She had lost Jake. And no amount of messages, apologies, or actions would bring them back. Vanessa set the phone down, letting out a shaky breath. She had always believed that there was a way to make things right, a way to undo the mistakes she had made. But now, as she sat alone in her apartment, she realized that some things couldn't be fixed. Her heart ached, and the truth sank in. The life she had once known was gone. Ethan was gone. And in the silence of that realization, Vanessa understood that she had no one left to blame but herself. Ethan stood at the window of his new apartment, staring out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The weight that had crushed him for so long, the suffocating presence of betrayal, the constant ache of loss, was no longer pressing down on him. It was still there, somewhere deep inside, but it was quieter now, more distant. The past few weeks had been a blur, moving into this apartment, cutting off contact with Vanessa, blocking out the endless stream of messages and pleas. At first, the silence had been unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in, and every moment of stillness reminded him of everything he had lost. But as the days passed, the noise in his head began to settle. He realized he could be okay without her. He could be whole again. His phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Laura, the colleague he had reconnected with after his marriage ended. She had been a steady presence during his recovery, someone who had listened without judgment. He smiled as he opened the message. "Hey, are we still on for dinner tonight? I found a new place downtown. Thought you might like it." Ethan's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before he typed back, "Sounds good. I'll be there." It had been a few months since they had started spending more time together. At first, it had been simple. A cup of coffee, casual conversations about work. But something had changed. There was an ease between them that he hadn't felt in a long time, a comfort that came from sharing the same brokenness. Laura had her own story, her own scars from past relationships, and somehow it made everything feel less lonely. She didn't try to fix him, she simply understood. As Ethan grabbed his jacket and keys, he paused at the door, looking around the apartment once more. It wasn't much, a small, sparsely furnished space with bare walls and minimal decoration, but it was his. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was in control of his own life. He had nothing tying him down, nothing to hold him back. It was a strange feeling, freedom, but not the kind he had envisioned. It wasn't a sudden escape from his problems. It was quieter, more subdued. It was the kind of freedom that came from facing the pain, dealing with the loss, and coming out on the other side stronger, even if that strength felt fragile at times. The dinner with Laura went smoothly, the conversation flowing effortlessly as they ate. It was the first time in a long while that Ethan had felt truly present in a moment. He found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, something he hadn't done in months. Laura's easy smile and the way she listened, really listened, made him realize how much he had missed being seen. As the evening wound down, Laura turned to him with a soft smile. "You know, I'm glad you're doing better. You deserve to find happiness again, Ethan." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time he didn't feel the tightness in his chest. He didn't feel the weight of what he had lost. He felt a glimmer of something else, a sense of possibility. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "Thanks, Laura," Ethan replied, his voice steady, more sure than it had been in a long time. "I think I'm finally starting to see that." After dinner, they parted ways with a hug. As Ethan walked back to his apartment, the cool night air filled his lungs, the city lights sparkling ahead of him. He had no idea what the future held. There were still pieces of his past scattered around, still moments of anger and sorrow, but for the first time, they didn't define him. He was beginning to rebuild, not just his life, but himself. And that was enough for now. Ethan opened the door to his apartment and stepped inside. The silence was there, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. There was space now, space for something new, for a life that was his to shape. As he sat on the couch, staring at the empty room around him, he realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Ryan. "How's the new place? Feeling more at home?" Ethan smiled and typed back, "I think I'm getting there." It wasn't a perfect life, but it was his life. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Jake sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. He had been working tirelessly for weeks, dealing with the aftermath of the business deal that had recently collapsed. The deal that had promised to skyrocket his career, the one he had been so confident about, had turned into a disaster. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with calls and emails from clients, colleagues, and investors, all asking questions he couldn't answer. The pressure was suffocating, and the weight of his failure was sinking in deeper with every minute that passed. What he hadn't anticipated was that his fall from grace would be so swift and so public. Jake's phone vibrated again. The name on the screen made his stomach turn. It was Vanessa. He hadn't spoken to her in days, but he had heard through the grapevine that things weren't going well for her, that Ethan was truly gone. She had messaged him once or twice, but Jake didn't have the time or energy for her anymore. He had his own problems to deal with. As he stared at the phone, his mind began to race. Vanessa had been his escape, the distraction from the mounting pressure in his professional life. When things had been good with her, he had felt invincible. But now everything was unraveling. His career, his reputation, and the fleeting relationship with Vanessa were all slipping through his fingers. He answered the call. "Jake!" Vanessa's voice was shaky, strained. "We need to talk. I don't know where things went wrong, but Not now, Vanessa." Jake cut her off, his tone sharp, cold. He didn't have the energy for this, not with everything collapsing around him. She was silent for a beat before speaking again, this time with more urgency. "Jake, things are falling apart. I need you. I thought we had something real, but now everything is a mess. I can't handle it alone." Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to push down the rising frustration. "I can't deal with this right now. I've got bigger problems." "Bigger problems?" Vanessa's voice cracked. "You don't even see it, do you? You're losing everything. You lost me, and now you're losing yourself. You're drowning in your own choices." Jake clenched his jaw. "I'm not drowning, I'm in control." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. His business was crumbling, his reputation in tatters, and Vanessa, well, she was a distant memory now. He had used her. He had used her to fill the void in his life, to escape from the overwhelming pressure, but now she was gone. She was gone, and so were his chances of redemption. The truth was undeniable. His world was collapsing, and it had nothing to do with Vanessa. It was all his doing. He had lied, manipulated, and destroyed every relationship that mattered in his pursuit of success. The final blow came when the firm he had been working with sent him an email, notifying him that his association with the company was being terminated. He stared at the message, the words on the screen a harsh reminder of how far he had fallen. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Vanessa's calls, his business, and everything he had built were all disappearing. He was sinking, and there was no one left to pull him out. Hours later, he sat in his office, numb, the reality of everything that had happened crashing over him. The world he had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and he couldn't fix it. He had nothing left. Jake glanced around the empty office, the cold walls reflecting his isolation. He had driven everyone away, used everyone who had ever cared for him, and now he was alone, just like Vanessa had warned him. The sound of his phone vibrating again startled him, and he picked it up, expecting it to be another business call. But instead, it was a text from Vanessa. "I hope you're happy now, Jake. I hope you find what you've been looking for. I'm done." The message hit him harder than anything else, because it wasn't just the end of their relationship. It was the realization that he had lost everything he had ever truly wanted, and it was too late to fix it. Jake's downfall had begun the moment he made his first choice, the first lie, the first betrayal, and now there was nothing left but the painful consequences of his own actions. Ethan had been avoiding Vanessa's calls for days, but today was different. The message had come through just an hour ago, and the weight of it still hung heavy in the air. She wanted to talk. She wanted one last conversation, a final attempt at fixing what had been broken beyond repair. "Ethan, please, I need to see you. There's so much I need to say." He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt, the reflection staring back at him, looking a little older, a little more worn than he remembered. He had been through hell in the last few months, betrayal, heartache, and loneliness. But this moment felt different. There was a finality in the air. He didn't know what she was going to say, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. He had made his peace with the loss, with everything that had come before. He was done. But part of him, the part that had loved her so deeply, couldn't just shut the door completely. He needed closure. The doorbell rang. Ethan took a deep breath and walked toward the door. His hand paused on the knob for just a second, and then he opened it. Vanessa stood there, her eyes red, her face pale. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything she had done was pressing down on her. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, as if waiting for him to say something. Anything. "You wanted to talk?" Ethan said, his voice low and controlled. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing the pain she had caused him. Not anymore. Vanessa nodded, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know I've hurt you, and I can never take that back, but I can't just let you walk away thinking that I don't regret everything." He closed the door behind her and leaned against it, his arms crossed. "Regret? You regret it now? After everything that's happened?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, the raw emotion barely contained. "Yes, I regret it. I regret everything. I was selfish. I was blinded by my own desires, and I let you go. I let us go. I never meant for any of this to happen. But I'm here now, Ethan. I'm begging you to hear me out. I don't want to lose you." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Lose me? You already lost me. You lost me the moment you chose him over me, the moment you lied to my face and broke my trust. You didn't just lose me, Vanessa. You destroyed everything we had." She took a step closer, her eyes pleading, desperate. "I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you. I still love you. I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you beyond measure, but I can't live with the guilt of losing you forever." Ethan felt his resolve beginning to slip, but he quickly shoved it down. "What do you want me to say, Vanessa? That it's okay? That we can go back to the way things were? Because that's never going to happen. You can't just erase what you did." She reached for his arm, but he pulled away, taking a step back. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice sharp. The pain of her betrayal was still fresh, and the anger surged to the surface again. "You made your choice. You don't get to decide when it's over for me." Tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself. I know I can't fix it. I can't undo the damage I've done, but please, Ethan, don't walk away from me. I'm asking for one last chance. I don't want to live the rest of my life knowing that I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Ethan shook his head, his heart aching with every word she spoke, but he couldn't let himself believe her, not anymore. "You had your chance, Vanessa, and you threw it away. I can't keep doing this with you. I can't keep pretending like you didn't betray me, like you didn't break me. I'm not the same person I was when I loved you, and I can't go back to that." There was a long silence between them, a heavy, suffocating quiet. Vanessa's shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stared at him, as if hoping that somehow something would change. But Ethan knew. He had known the moment he walked away from her. The truth was inescapable. They were done. They could never go back to what they had. "You need to leave," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was no room for negotiation in his tone. Vanessa looked at him one last time, her face contorting with pain, but she didn't fight him. She nodded silently, turning to walk toward the door. As she stepped outside, Ethan stood there, his back against the wall, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. He could hear her footsteps fade, and then there was nothing. The door clicked shut. For a long time, Ethan didn't move. He didn't know if he was relieved or empty, but he knew this: it was finally over. There was no going back, not for him, not for her. Ethan stood at the window of his apartment. The city sprawled out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun. The world was moving on, and for the first time in months he felt like he was too. He had spent so many days looking backward, clinging to the pain of what had been lost. But now, in the quiet stillness of his new life, he was beginning to realize something. The future was still his to shape. He had faced the worst of it, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the devastation. But now it was time to rebuild, time to let go of the past and embrace the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The text from Laura earlier that day had sparked something in him. "How's everything going? You've been quiet." The question had been simple, but it had reminded him that he wasn't alone. Laura had been there for him, a steady presence as he found his way back to himself. He picked up his phone and typed a quick reply. "I'm good, really. Just figuring things out." For the first time in a long time, the words felt true. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He was learning how to move forward, how to exist without the constant shadow of betrayal hanging over him. Ethan had been through hell, but he had survived it. And now, there was a part of him that wanted to see what life could be like when it wasn't defined by the pain of the past. As he set his phone down, a soft knock came at the door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been expecting anyone, but when he opened the door, he saw Laura standing there, her smile warm, her eyes full of understanding. "Hey," she said softly. "You up for a walk?" Ethan stepped aside to let her in. "Yeah, let me grab my jacket." As they walked through the streets of the city, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about work, about life, about small things that didn't feel so heavy anymore. And for the first time in months, Ethan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing. Not out of nervousness or discomfort, but because he was enjoying the moment. There was no pressure, no unresolved pain. Just two people talking, sharing space, letting the world around them exist without needing to fix everything in it. At one point, as they paused on a quiet street corner, Laura turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said. "You're not the same person you were when we first started talking." He smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't quite faded. "I don't think I'll ever be the same. I don't think I'm supposed to be." Laura nodded in understanding. "No, you're not. But you're better, you're stronger, and you've got a lot of life ahead of you." Ethan's heart ached with the weight of her words. She was right. The person he was now, broken but healing, wasn't the person he had been when Vanessa first came into his life. He had learned things about himself he never would have understood if he hadn't gone through the pain. And while the hurt would never fully disappear, it was no longer his identity. It didn't define him anymore. "I'm trying," Ethan said quietly, the words feeling like a promise, not just to Laura but to himself. "I'm really trying." Laura smiled, squeezing his arm gently. "I know you are, and you don't have to do it alone." As they continued their walk, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. It was the quiet understanding that the life he had wanted with Vanessa was gone. But that didn't mean his life was over. He still had the chance to build something new, something that was his. No more lies, no more broken promises. Just him, taking one step at a time into a future that was his to create. The past was a part of him, but it didn't own him anymore. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Ethan felt a peace that he hadn't known for months. He was moving forward, not for Vanessa, not for anyone else, but for himself. And that was enough. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, the morning sun casting a gentle light over the room. His phone sat beside him, silent. The screen still glowed from the message Vanessa had sent last night. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I regret everything. Please, I don't know what else to say, but I need you to know I've changed. I'm not the woman I was." He had read it 3 times already. Every word stung like salt in an open wound. He had moved on. He had taken control of his life, yet her words still had a power over him. Not the power to hurt him anymore, but the power to remind him of everything he had lost. The past few months had been a journey of painful self-discovery. He had learned to let go of the anger, the sorrow, and finally, the bitterness. But even now, with his new life beginning to take shape, there was one thing he hadn't fully done: closure. He stood up, taking a deep breath. The thought of seeing Vanessa again, after everything, stirred something in him, something raw and unhealed. But it wasn't fear. It was an opportunity to finally close the door on the past and move forward without any lingering doubts, any remaining questions. Ethan grabbed his coat and left his apartment, stepping into the crisp morning air. The walk to her place was slow, deliberate. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he knew it needed to happen. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about him finally accepting the fact that their story had ended. When he reached her building, he stood outside for a moment, the door before him a final barrier between the past and the future. He took one last breath, steadying himself, before knocking. It felt like hours before the door finally opened. Vanessa stood there, her face a mixture of hope and apprehension. She looked different, more fragile than before, as though the weight of everything she had done was now too much to bear. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came." He nodded, his voice calm. "I came to talk, to finally put this to rest." Vanessa stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. He hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. The apartment felt so familiar, yet so foreign. It had once been a place where their shared dreams had flourished, but now it was just another reminder of the past. They sat down across from each other, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Vanessa spoke first, her words quiet, almost pleading. "Ethan, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I've never felt so much regret in my life." Ethan listened, but didn't interrupt. He had heard these words before many times. He had heard them when she apologized, when she tried to justify her actions, when she begged him to come back. But this time it felt different. This time he could hear the sincerity in her voice, the desperation that mirrored his own from the past. "I've destroyed everything," she continued, her voice breaking, "and I know you'll never be able to forget what I did. I don't expect you to. But I want you to know that I've changed. I've realized what I lost, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my life." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over him. He had spent so many nights thinking about this moment, imagining how he would react, what he would say. But now that it was here, it was different. He wasn't angry, he wasn't sad, he was empty, but finally at peace. "I don't need you to change for me," he said quietly. "You're right. I won't forget what happened, but I don't need you to try and fix it. I'm not here for closure, Vanessa. I'm here to tell you that I've already found it. Her eyes searched his face, confusion flickering for a moment before she nodded slowly, understanding sinking in. I've moved on, Ethan continued, the finality of the words sinking deep within him. And I need you to understand that. We can't go back. Not to what we were, not to who we were. Vanessa looked down, tears filling her eyes once again, but this time they weren't tears of pleading or regret. They were tears of acceptance. She had hurt him, but now she was letting go too. Ethan stood up, taking a deep breath. I'll always care about you. I'll always remember the good times, but us, it's over. And I think, finally, I'm okay with that. Vanessa nodded, wiping her tears away. I'll never forget you, Ethan. I just hope you find what you're looking for. With one last look, Ethan turned and walked out of the apartment, the door closing softly behind him. As he stepped into the hallway, he realized something. He wasn't just walking out of her life. He was walking into his own. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. And he knew with every step he took away from that door that he was ready for whatever came next.